Okay, the title of my talk is Questioning My Whiteness, a white, open brackets, ex-psychiatrist perspective, close brackets. In 1983, on my first day as a consultant psychiatrist at Manchester Royal Infirmary, I was shocked to discover that most of the patients waiting to see me on the inpatient unit that morning were young black men from Moss Side. Nearly all were compulsory patients with diagnoses of schizophrenia. Nothing in my training had prepared me for this. I soon discovered that this was the case in all our large cities, London, Bristol, Liverpool, Birmingham, Leeds, Nottingham, all cities, of course, with large black communities. Something was seriously wrong here, I thought. So some months later, I ventured out into the communities from which these young men came to talk to their families, community groups, and activists. I wanted to hear what they had to say about the situation. Pardon me. One of the first places I visited was George Jackson House, a hostel for homeless young black men set up by Manchester's black community in the 1970s. As Mrs. White, the manager, and I got to know each other, we shared anecdotes about our backgrounds. It was spring, and the bulbs were in flower in nearby Alexandra Park. She recited a line of poetry, which at first I didn't recognize. "But you must know Wordsworth's Daffodils," she said, chiding me gently. In truth, I was shocked that she knew the poem better than I did myself, but I wasn't prepared for what she said next. Back home in Jamaica, we were taught all about England, English monarchs, history, literature, and poetry. We were taught that we were part of one great family under the Queen. I didn't have the wits then to ask her what she was taught about black history and culture. Later, I discovered, much later this was, I discovered that in those days, white civil servants in London decided what black school children in Jamaica and across the colonies should know about history. Fast forward 3 years or so to a key moment in questioning my whiteness. Mrs. White and I started to meet regularly, and she invited some of her black colleagues to our meetings, youth and family workers, community development workers, a probation officer, and a social worker. After a year or so, they asked, would I set aside time to watch a film with them? The title was Black, a documentary about the role of the British in slavery. It clearly mattered to them that we should see it together, so I agreed. It was an experience that changed my life. We met at Moss Side Social Services on a hot, humid afternoon in early July. 2 miles down the road, the West Indies were thrashing England in the third test at Old Trafford. There were 6 or 7 of us, and I was the only white person there. The film detailed the history of slavery, the appalling conditions under which men, women, and children were cramped in the holds of slave ships on the Middle Passage, the loss of life, and what happened to them when they arrived in the Caribbean. I'd never heard of slave auctions before, nor understood their links to the wealth of cities like London, Bristol, and Liverpool. This, of course, was a history that I hadn't been taught at school. At first, I tried to switch off. These events happened long ago, I thought. How could they possibly be relevant to life in Britain today? Then I felt hurt and resentful. My liberal values and belief in social justice were very important, still are very important to me, but it felt as if they were accusing me of being a racist. My feelings were so intense that at one point I almost ran out. I felt panicky, my mouth was dry, my throat tight, my stomach churned. I kept glancing at my watch and out of the window. I shifted uneasily in my seat. Just at the point when my feelings were almost unbearable, I suddenly realized that the film documented the history behind the presence of my black colleagues in that room. It was because of the history of slavery, colonialism, empire, and commonwealth, and the role that we white people had played in this, that they were here in England. Black people had responded to the call to support the motherland in 2 world wars, and afterwards they responded to pleas to help rebuild the country, arriving first, of course, on SS Windrush. but it was their forebears who'd been crammed in the holds of the slave ships by my forebears. And for all I knew, my ancestors had profited from this trade in human souls. I began to realize that our histories are enmeshed, and it simply isn't possible for us to shrug our shoulders and disentangle ourselves from the tragedy of each other's histories. In moral terms, our complicity in slavery as white people is unavoidable even today. This filled me with guilt, which eased when I realized that at least they trusted me sufficiently to ask me to watch the film with them. This filled me with hope. No matter how uncomfortable I felt, I would perhaps in time be able to work through my mixed responses to this history and the role that whiteness had played in it. Over 30 years later, I still struggle with this. But if we are to understand each other, we have to accept the consequences of our shared histories for our lives together in the present. This means that white people must accept in good faith the fact that our forebears did the most terrible things to people of other races. Not facing up to this fact and accepting it erases any hope of progress and understanding. Whiteness comes with a particular set of assumptions, values, and beliefs that are taken to be self-evident and beyond question. And this has a number of consequences. First, because of the taken for granted nature of whiteness and white privilege, we are unaware of how it shapes the way we see the world. Consequently, when non-white people challenge our view of the world, we feel uncomfortable and act defensively. This is one aspect of what Robin DiAngelo calls white fragility, and I quote, a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. This description, as far as I'm concerned, is accurate and precise, both for my experiences in Manchester back in the 1980s and today in many white professionals when you try to raise the matter of racism with them. Second, whiteness is heavily laden with assumptions about the preeminence of white culture. White culture and white history and white achievements to the exclusion of non-white cultures, histories, and achievements, as Angela Saini points out in this excellent book, which is a must-read. This is why Black Lives Matters is so important. It insists on the equal value and importance of Black histories. A headline in this morning's Guardian reads, "The national curriculum systematically omits Black British history." This is why moves to integrate Black history into the school curriculum is so important, as our moves to decolonize university courses in the humanities, science, and medicine. Rennie Edo-Lodge, in her book, Why I've Stopped, just give me a moment, let me get there we go. Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, again, another must read, she struggles to define white privilege. How do you define an absence, she asks, because, and I quote, white privilege is an absence of the negative consequences of racism. It's an absence of funny looks directed at you because you believe to be in the wrong place. My role as a psychiatrist revealed the power of whiteness. Laws decreed by an almost exclusively white parliament and enacted through a largely white legal and medical profession impact disproportionately on Black people. These laws mean that white people like me could force Black people to receive powerful drugs against their wishes, lock them up, restrain, detain them, and in the worst cases, even cause their death. The term mental disorder instantiated my power as a white person. And all the time, the great cop-out, we're colorblind here, makes it impossible to talk about whiteness with white colleagues. Racism and white privilege are intimately bound together. To acknowledge one forces you to acknowledge your role in the other. Suman Fernando, another book you must read, describes vividly how they operate in psychiatry and clinical psychology. They are figure and ground, hand and glove, tongue in closed mouth. In my experience, most psychiatrists respond to any discussion of racism in psychiatry in ways that mirrored my initial response to the documentary all those years ago. They become edgy and touchy. Their body language indicates they want to escape. Psychiatrists, of course, are not alone here. Clinical psychologists, psychiatric nurses, and social workers all respond in the same way if you try to discuss racism in mental health. But today, the rise of fascism and racial intolerance in our society makes it essential that white people reflect on the consequences of whiteness. If we fail to do this, racial hatred, intolerance, and division will spread throughout our society, poisoning all our futures. Thank you very much.